Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. For Rachel Chen, that surprise came on an ordinary Tuesday morning at the Sweet Bean Cafe, where she had been grabbing her daily coffee for the past 3 years. As a 35-year-old single mom working as a real estate agent, her life revolved around showing houses, attending her daughter Emmy's school events, and trying to maintain some semblance of a social life. That morning started like any other. Rachel was running late after helping Emmy finish her science project, a detailed model of the solar system that had taken them until midnight to complete. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she hadn't even bothered with makeup. The cafe was packed, and as she waited in line, she accidentally bumped into the man standing behind her, causing her phone to clatter to the floor. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, bending down to retrieve it. But another hand got there first, a hand belonging to a well-dressed man in his late 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, handing back her phone with a slight bow that made Rachel laugh despite her embarrassment. That man was David Parker, and he would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. They started talking while waiting in line, and Rachel found herself charmed by his easy manner and genuine interest in her stories about Emmy. David mentioned he was new in town, having recently moved to take a position as an investment banker at one of the city's top firms. What started as a chance encounter turned into coffee dates, then dinner dates, and soon, regular family outings with Emmy. David was everything Rachel hadn't known she was looking for: successful but humble, funny without being crude, and most importantly, he seemed to genuinely care about Emmy's well-being. Emmy, who was usually skeptical of any man her mom dated, surprised Rachel by warming up to David quickly. Maybe it was because he never talked down to her, or because he showed up to her school's science fair even though he had an important meeting that day. He stood there, still in his business suit, asking thoughtful questions about her project on renewable energy, and Rachel felt her heart melt a little more. Their relationship progressed naturally over the next 18 months. David became a constant presence in their lives, bringing stability and joy that Rachel hadn't realized was missing. He helped Emmy with her math homework, taught her how to ride a bike, something Rachel had been too nervous to do, and even started a small vegetable garden with her in their backyard. Rachel's friends noticed the change in her too. "You're glowing," her best friend Linda would say during their weekly coffee meetups. "David's really good for you both," and he was. Unlike her previous relationships, where she'd felt pressured to hide her role as a mother or apologize for having less free time, David embraced their little family unit completely. The proposal came during a casual Sunday afternoon at home. They were all in the kitchen making pizza together, their weekly tradition. Flour dusted every surface, and the radio played softly in the background. David had just shown Amy how to toss the dough in the air, resulting in more than a few pieces stuck to the ceiling, when he suddenly got serious. He looked at Rachel, then at Amy, and said, "You know, I never thought I'd be lucky enough to find a family like this." Then he reached into the flour-covered pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small box. Rachel's hands flew to her mouth as he got down on one knee, covered in flour and tomato sauce. But what made the moment even more special was that before asking Rachel to marry him, he turned to Amy and asked, "Would it be okay if I became a permanent part of your family?" Amy, trying to act cool but failing to hide her excitement, pretended to think about it before breaking into a huge grin and nodding enthusiastically. Only then did David turn back to Rachel and open the box, revealing a beautiful but modest ring that was exactly her style. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice full of hope and love. Rachel couldn't speak through her tears, so she just nodded, and Emmy cheered loud enough for all three of them. That evening, as they sat eating their slightly burnt but perfect pizzas, Rachel looked at her small family and felt complete. David was telling Emmy about his plans to convert the spare room into a proper study space for her, and Emmy was excitedly adding her own ideas. The ring on Rachel's finger caught the light, and she smiled, thinking about how sometimes the best things in life come from ordinary moments like spilled coffee and flour-covered proposals. The next few months were a whirlwind of wedding planning, with Emmy throwing herself into the role of junior wedding planner with impressive dedication. She had strong opinions about everything from the flower arrangements to the cake flavors, and David patiently listened to each one of her suggestions as if they were coming from a professional wedding planner. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But isn't that how all great love stories start? With a chance meeting, a perfect romance, and a beautiful engagement. Rachel had no way of knowing that her perfect love story was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test the bonds of family in ways she never could have imagined. As the wedding date drew closer, little things started changing in their once perfect world. At first, they were so small that nobody except Emmy seemed to notice. It began with David's phone habits. He used to keep his phone face up on the table during family dinners, often sharing funny memes or interesting news articles he'd found. But lately, his phone was always face down, and he jumped slightly whenever it buzzed. One evening, while helping her mom fold laundry, Emmy tried to bring it up. "Mom, have you noticed how David acts weird about his phone now?" she asked, carefully matching up pairs of socks. Rachel just laughed and ruffled her daughter's hair. "Honey, he's probably dealing with some big work projects. You know how busy investment banking can get." But Emmy couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She started paying more attention to the little details, the kind adults often miss because they're too busy with grown-up things. Like how David would step outside to take calls, even in the middle of their favorite TV shows. Or how he'd quickly switch tabs on his laptop whenever someone walked behind him. The changes in their home life were subtle too. David, who used to love cooking dinner with them, started working later and later. Just finishing up some important deals, he'd say, kissing Rachel on the cheek when he finally got home. But Emmy noticed how he'd immediately head to the home office instead of spending time with them like before. Then came the weird conversations about money. Emmy couldn't help but overhear, okay, maybe she was deliberately listening, when David started talking to her mom about combining their bank accounts before the wedding. "It's just more practical this way," he explained, showing Rachel some complicated-looking documents. "Plus, it'll make it easier to manage the wedding expenses." What really set off alarm bells was the day Emmy came home early from her art club. She heard David in the office, speaking in a tone she'd never heard him use before. "Look, we need to move everything before the wedding," he was saying in a harsh whisper. "No, you don't understand. This has to be clean. No traces." When Emmy accidentally bumped into a hall table, making a small noise, David quickly ended the call. The next day, David was extra nice to her, bringing home her favorite ice cream and asking about her day. But Emmy noticed how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. It reminded her of Tommy Baker in her class, who always acted super sweet right after he'd done something wrong. Emmy started keeping a diary of all the strange things she noticed. She wrote down dates, times, and details of weird phone calls or unusual behavior. She wasn't sure why she was doing it at first, it just felt important somehow. Her best friend, Katie, thought she was being paranoid, but Katie hadn't seen how David's whole personality seemed to shift when he thought no one was watching. The changes in her mom were worrying too. Rachel, usually so organized and independent, started deferring to David on everything. When he suggested she cut back on her real estate work to focus on the wedding, she agreed without hesitation. When he recommended she close her personal investment account and let him handle their finances, she signed the papers with a trusting smile. One afternoon, while looking for a stapler in the home office, David was at work, and she really needed it for her homework. Emmy found something that made her stomach drop. Hidden behind some folders was a stack of mail addressed to different names, but with David's photo on the IDs. She quickly took pictures with her phone before putting everything back exactly as she found it. That night, she could barely sleep. The David she thought she knew, the man who taught her to ride a bike and made silly jokes during pizza night, was starting to feel like a stranger. She watched him at breakfast the next morning, wondering how someone could seem exactly the same and completely different at the same time. The final straw came 3 weeks before the wedding. Annie was sitting on the stairs, supposedly doing homework, when she heard David on another late-night call. "Everything's in place," he was saying. "She has no idea. Once we're married, I'll have full access to everything. The house, the inheritance, all of it." There was a pause, then a laugh that sent chills down Amy's spine. "No, the kid won't be a problem. She's just a 12-year-old. Nobody listens to kids anyway." That night, Amy sat in her room for hours, staring at her evidence wall, hidden behind her Taylor Swift posters. She had photos, notes, dates, and times, all pointing to something very wrong with the man her mother was about to marry. But how could she make her mom see the truth? Rachel was so happy, so in love with the idea of their perfect family. Looking at a recent family photo on her desk, the three of them at the engagement party, all smiles and hope, Annie felt tears welling up in her eyes. But she quickly wiped them away. She was her mother's daughter, after all, and Chen women didn't give up when things got tough. She needed help, though, real help. And as she looked at her mom's smiling face in the photo, Annie knew she had to act fast. The wedding was just weeks away, and she had a horrible feeling that once those vows were said, it would be too late to stop whatever David was planning. She needed proof, real, solid proof that even her love-struck mother couldn't ignore. But where would she find it? And more importantly, would anyone believe her if she did? They say desperate times call for desperate measures, and Amy had never felt more desperate in her 12 years of life. After finding those strange IDs in David's office, she knew she needed help, but not just any help. She needed someone smart, someone who wouldn't just dismiss her as a kid with an overactive imagination. That's where Katie came in. Katie wasn't just Emmy's best friend, she was also the daughter of a computer programmer and had picked up quite a few tech skills from her dad. "You're not going to like what I found," Katie said one afternoon, hunched over her laptop in Amy's bedroom. They had Googled all the names from the IDs Amy had photographed, and what they discovered made both girls' blood run cold. "Look at this," Katie pointed to an old news article. "This guy, using the name Daniel Phillips, see the photo? That's definitely David." The article was from 3 years ago, talking about a man who had disappeared right after his wedding, along with his new wife's entire savings. There were other articles too, with different names but the same face. Always the same pattern. A whirlwind romance, a quick marriage, and then, poof, gone with all the money. Annie felt sick to her stomach. "We have to tell my mom," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Rachel was so happy, so convinced that David was her perfect match. She'd never believe it without solid proof. That's when Operation Truth began. Amy started recording everything on her phone, not just David's suspicious phone calls, but also the way he acted around her mom, the things he said about money, everything. Katie helped her organize the evidence in a secure cloud folder, just in case something happened to Amy's phone. One day, while David was supposedly at work, Amy spotted his car parked outside a coffee shop across town. She was on her way back from swimming practice with Katie's mom when she saw it. "Can we stop for a smoothie?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Once inside, she saw David sitting with a man she'd never seen before, looking at papers spread across the table. She pretended to be choosing a drink while secretly recording a video with her phone. The papers looked like bank statements, she told Katie later that day. And David kept pointing at numbers and whispering. He looked different, not like the David who makes us pancakes on Sundays. The hardest part wasn't collecting evidence, it was watching her mom fall deeper into David's trap. Rachel had always been strong and independent, but lately she seemed to be fading into David's shadow. She'd stopped going to her weekly book club, saying she needed to focus on wedding preparations. She barely spent time with her old friends anymore, and when she did, David always seemed to find a reason to tag along. Then came the day Annie overheard David talking about her mom's inheritance. She knew her grandparents had left Rachel some money, but she'd never known how much. "The house alone is worth $500,000, David was saying into his phone. "And the investment accounts? Yeah, all of it, just 2 more weeks." That night, Annie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, thinking about all the little moments that had seemed odd, but not quite wrong enough to raise alarm. The way David had slowly isolated her mom from her friends. How he always had a reasonable explanation for everything. How he'd started suggesting that maybe Emmy should go to boarding school after the wedding, for better educational opportunities, he'd said. Using Katie's help, they dug deeper into David's past. They found social media posts from other women, all with similar stories. A charming man who seemed too good to be true, who swept them off their feet, who wanted to marry quickly. Then, after the wedding, everything disappeared. Their money, their happiness, and the man they thought they knew. But the real breakthrough came when Katie managed to find a private investigator's blog post about marriage scams. The post described exactly what David was doing, right down to the way he targeted successful single moms. There was even a hotline number for reporting suspected fraud. Amy's hands shook as she dialed the number from Katie's house phone. She couldn't risk calling from home. David seemed to know everything that happened there. The woman who answered was kind but serious. She listened to Amy's story, asked detailed questions, and then said something that made Amy's heart race. "We've been looking for this man for a long time." That evening, as Amy sat at dinner watching David charm her mother with stories about his fake charity work, she felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The wedding was just days away. She had a folder full of evidence, contact information for 3 of David's previous victims, and a plan starting to form in her mind. Looking at her mom's happy face across the dinner table, Amy knew she had to be brave. Rachel had always protected her. Now it was her turn to protect her mom. But she had to be smart about it. One wrong move, and David might disappear with everything her mom had worked so hard for. As she pushed her food around her plate, Amy thought about all the crime shows she'd watched with her mom. The good guys always won in those shows, but this was real life. She needed to make sure her next move would be perfect. Because she had a feeling she would only get one chance to expose David for who he really was. 3 days before the wedding, Amy sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by printouts, photos, and sticky notes. Katie sat beside her, both girls staring at the laptop screen in disbelief. What they'd just discovered was worse than anything they'd imagined. "Are you absolutely sure?" Amy whispered, though they were alone in the house. Her mom was out for her final dress fitting, and David was supposedly at work. Katie nodded, pointing at the screen. "Look, it's all here. His real name is Daniel White. He's been doing this for 8 years. Amy, 8 years. The police reports they'd found painted a horrifying picture. Daniel White, aka David Parker, aka Daniel Phillips, aka 5 other names, had a pattern. He would find successful single moms, charm them and their kids, then marry them quickly. Within weeks of the wedding, he would drain their accounts and disappear, leaving behind devastated families and empty bank accounts. "Mom's going to lose everything," Amy said, her voice shaking. The inheritance from her grandparents, the house they'd lived in since Annie was a baby, even her mom's retirement savings. David had slowly been getting his name added to all of it. "The wedding's in 3 days. We have to stop this." Just then, Amy's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Wilson, their elderly neighbor. "Sweetie, isn't your mom's fiancé supposed to be at work? I just saw him loading boxes into his car." Amy's heart stopped. She and Katie raced to the window just in time to see David's car pulling away from the storage unit complex down the street. "He's starting already," Annie said. "He's getting ready to run." They watched as his car turned the corner, heading toward the bank. What happened next was like something out of a movie, but scarier because it was real. Amy and Katie rode their bikes to the bank, keeping a safe distance. Through the glass windows, they could see David talking to a bank teller, gesturing at papers. Amy's hands shook as she took photos with her phone. Back home, they discovered something even more chilling. While looking through the documents Amy had gathered, Katie noticed a pattern in the dates. "Amy, look at this. All his previous disappearances, they happened the day after the wedding, every single time." Amy felt cold all over. She'd thought they had more time, that maybe they could stop the wedding itself. But David was clearly planning to attend the wedding, say his vows, dance at the reception, and then vanish with everything her mom owned. That evening, when Rachel came home excited about her final dress fitting, Amy tried one last time to raise her concerns. "Mom, don't you think everything with David is moving really fast? Maybe we should wait a bit longer." But Rachel just smiled that dreamy smile she'd had ever since the engagement. "Oh honey, when you're older, you'll understand. When something's right, you just know." She hugged Andy close. "I know change is scary, but David loves us. We're going to be such a happy family." Amy hugged her mom back, breathing in her familiar perfume, fighting back tears. How could she make her mom understand without breaking her heart? The evidence was overwhelming, but Rachel was so deeply in love with the idea of their perfect family that she couldn't see what was right in front of her. Later that night, Amy heard David on another phone call in the backyard. "Everything's set," he was saying. "The accounts are ready for transfer. Yes, right after the ceremony." No, I've got a private car picking me up from the reception. Flights booked for midnight. Annie recorded everything, her hands trembling so much she could barely hold the phone steady. After David went back inside, she sat in her room, staring at the wedding invitation on her desk. It was beautiful, with silver hearts and flowing script announcing the union of Rachel Chen and David Parker. Except David Parker didn't really exist. The next morning, Katie came over early, before David woke up. They sat in Amy's treehouse, the one place they knew David never went, and looked through everything one final time. Police reports, bank documents, newspaper articles, social media posts from previous victims, and even a warning bulletin from the FBI's fraud division. It was all there. We need to tell someone who has to listen, Katie said firmly. Someone who can't ignore us just because we're kids. That's when Emmy remembered something she'd seen on a true crime show she'd watched with her mom. Something about mandatory reporters and emergency services. As they climbed down from the treehouse, Emmy looked up at her bedroom window, where she could see the dress she'd be wearing as a bridesmaid hanging on her closet door. Her mom had been so excited when they picked it out together, talking about their perfect family future. Annie thought about all the other families David had destroyed, all the other kids who might have tried to warn their moms but weren't believed. She couldn't let her mom become another victim. She couldn't let David hurt any more families. With shaking hands, Amy pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She had everything documented: dates, times, evidence, account numbers, previous aliases. Tomorrow was the wedding rehearsal. The day after that would be too late. She looked at Katie, who nodded encouragingly. "It's time," Katie said softly. "You have to do it." Amy took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do, but knowing didn't make it any easier. Because whatever happened next would change everything, and there would be no going back. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, but Amy felt like she was walking through a nightmare. She sat at the kitchen table, barely touching her breakfast, watching her mom flutter around the house in her silk robe, happiness radiating from every movement. The wedding dress hung in its protective bag by the door, waiting for its moment. "Isn't it perfect?" Rachel beamed, adjusting the flowers that had just been delivered. "Everything is just perfect." Amy forced a smile, her stomach churning. In her pocket, her phone felt heavy with the weight of everything she'd discovered. The bridal party gathered at the church early. Amy watched as her mom's friends helped with her hair and makeup, everyone laughing and taking photos. Through it all, she kept one eye on David, who arrived looking perfectly put together in his expensive tuxedo. But Amy noticed things the others missed, like how he kept checking his phone or the way his eyes darted to the exits. "You okay, sweetie?" Aunt Linda asked, catching Amy staring into space while getting her hair done. "Just wedding day jitters," Amy managed to say. If only they knew. If only they could see what she saw. During the preparation, Amy slipped away to the church's back office, pretending she needed to fix her dress. She'd pulled out her phone and checked the folder one last time. Everything was there. The evidence, the police reports, the photos, all backed up to multiple places. She'd learned from crime shows that backup was essential. Through the office window, she could see guests arriving, filling the parking lot with cars decorated with ribbons and flowers. Her mom's whole life was out there, friends, family, co-workers, all gathered to celebrate what they thought was a perfect love story. Annie felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. She watched David through the window as he greeted guests, playing his role perfectly. He was wearing the gold cufflinks Rachel had given him as an early wedding gift, probably the last expensive item he'd accept before taking everything else. The thought made Amy's blood boil. A notification popped up on her phone, a flight confirmation email she'd managed to find in David's deleted email folder thanks to Katie's tech skills. One-way ticket to a non-extradition country, departing at midnight, just like his previous escapes. The only difference was that this time, someone had caught on to his plan. Back in the bridal suite, Rachel was getting into her dress, tears of joy in her eyes as she looked in the mirror. "Emmy, honey, come here," she called, holding out her arms. Emmy hugged her mom tight, breathing in her familiar perfume mixed with the scent of hairspray and flowers. "I love you so much, Mom," she whispered, fighting back tears. "I love you too, sweetheart," Rachel smiled, wiping Amy's eyes carefully to not smudge her makeup. "I know change is scary, but this is going to be wonderful. David makes us so happy, doesn't he? Amy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as her mom put on the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, another family heirloom David would probably try to take. Not if Amy could help it. Through the window, she could hear the organist practicing the wedding march. Guests were being seated. David stood at the front of the church, checking his phone again. Amy knew what he was checking, probably confirming his getaway plans, making sure everything was in place for his grand disappearing act. She excused herself again, saying she needed water. Instead, she went to the church's small kitchen, where she hidden her backup phone, the one David didn't know about. She pulled up the document she'd prepared, double-checking every detail. Names, dates, account numbers, previous victims' statements, everything that proved who David really was. From the kitchen, she could hear the buzz of excitement in the church. The wedding coordinator was lining everyone up. In 15 minutes, the ceremony would begin. In less than an hour, her mum would be legally bound to a man who planned to destroy their lives. Unless. Amy's hands shook as she looked at the phone. She thought about all the other families David had ruined, all the other kids who might have suspected something but didn't know what to do. All the other moms who had their hearts broken and their lives shattered. She thought about her mom, strong, loving, independent Rachel, who had taught her to always stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Who had always said that love meant protecting the people you care about, even if they didn't understand why they needed protecting. Through the kitchen door, she could hear the wedding coordinator calling her name. It was time to line up for the processional. Amy looked at her phone one last time, then at her reflection in the kitchen window. She was wearing the pretty blue bridesmaid dress her mom had chosen, her hair perfectly curled, looking every bit the perfect daughter for the perfect wedding. But Amy knew that sometimes being a perfect daughter meant doing the hard thing, the right thing, even if it meant turning a perfect wedding day into something else entirely. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made her decision. As the first notes of the wedding march began to play, Amy Chen prepared to take the biggest risk of her young life, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything forever. With trembling fingers, Amy dialed 911. The sound of the wedding march filtered through the kitchen door as she pressed the phone to her ear, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the ringing. 1 ring. 2 rings. The coordinator would be looking for her now. 3 rings. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm and professional. Amy took a deep breath, just like she'd practiced. My name is Amy Chen. I'm at St. Michael's Church on Oak Street, and I need to report a fraud in progress. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. A man named David Parker, who's actually Daniel White, is about to marry my mom and steal everything we own. There was a brief pause. Amy could hear typing in the background. How old are you, Amy? I'm 12, she replied, but please don't hang up. I have proof, lots of proof. David Parker is wanted in 3 states for marriage fraud. He's done this before 7 times. He marries women and steals their money. He has a flight booked for midnight tonight. More typing sounds. Stay calm, Amy. Can you tell me more about the situation? Amy pulled out her backup phone, reading from her carefully prepared notes. His real name is Daniel White. He has outstanding warrants in Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio. I have copies of the police reports. He's using a fake identity. The real David Parker died in 2010. I found the death certificate. He's going to marry my mom and then steal our house, my grandparents' inheritance, everything. Through the kitchen door, she could hear people moving in the church. The music had changed. They were seating the last-minute guests. Soon, the wedding march would start for real. Are you in a safe place, Amy? The operator asked. Yes, I'm in the church kitchen, but please hurry. The wedding's starting any minute. He has papers ready to transfer all our accounts right after the ceremony. I found them in his briefcase. Amy's voice cracked. My mom doesn't know. She thinks he loves us. I'm dispatching officers now, the operator assured her. Can you describe Daniel White's appearance? Amy rattled off the description she'd memorized. He's wearing a black tuxedo with a white rose boutonniere. He's standing at the altar. You can't miss him. He's the groom. She paused, hearing footsteps approaching the kitchen. Someone's coming. I have to go. Wait, Emmy, the operator said quickly. The officers need to know if he's armed or dangerous. Emmy's blood ran cold. In all her investigation, she hadn't thought about that. I don't know. But he has a getaway car waiting behind the church, black sedan, tinted windows. I saw the driver earlier. The footsteps were getting closer. Emmy? It was Katie peeking into the kitchen. The coordinator's looking for you. It's almost time. Emmy spoke quickly into the phone. Please hurry. I have evidence on my phone and backed up online. I sent copies to the fraud division email too. Just, please don't let him hurt my mom. Officers are 3 minutes out, the operator assured her. Stay safe, Emmy. You're doing the right thing. As she ended the call, Emmy felt like she might throw up. Katie rushed over to her. Did you do it? Emmy nodded, unable to speak. Katie hugged her tight. You're the bravest person I know. The wedding coordinator's voice carried down the hall. Places, everyone. Places. Emmy straightened her dress with shaking hands. Katie, if this goes wrong. It won't, Katie interrupted. The truth always comes out. That's what your mom always says, right? They hurried back to the church entrance, where the bridal party was lining up. Emmy took her place in line, clutching her bouquet. Through the doors, she could see David at the altar, checking his phone one last time. Did he have any idea what was coming? Did he feel even a little bit guilty about what he was planning to do? The flower girl started down the aisle, scattering rose petals. Emmy's aunt went next, then her mom's college roommate. Katie, who was supposed to walk in front of Emmy, squeezed her hand before starting her walk. Emmy's turn came. As she stepped into the doorway, she heard it, faint but getting closer. Sirens. Her heart leaped into her throat. Why did they have to use sirens? Couldn't they have come quietly? Everything happened so fast, yet Emmy felt like she was watching in slow motion. The church doors burst open, but instead of her mom in her beautiful white dress, 3 police officers rushed in. Daniel White. One called out, "Stay where you are." David's face twisted into something ugly, nothing like the kind man who had made them Sunday pancakes. For a split second, he looked toward the side door, but 2 more officers appeared there. He was trapped. Then Emmy heard the sound she'd been dreading, her mom's confused voice from the church entrance. What's happening? David. The next few minutes were chaos. David tried to run, knocking over a flower arrangement. He didn't get far. The officers had him in handcuffs while guests stood shocked in their seats, phones out, recording everything. Someone screamed. The wedding coordinator fainted. But all Emmy could focus on was her mom. Rachel stood in the doorway, stunning in her wedding dress, one hand over her mouth, watching as the man she'd thought she would spend her life with was being read his rights. Ma'am, one of the officers approached Rachel gently. We need to talk to you about Mr. White here. He's wanted in 3 states for fraud and theft. Emmy ran to her mom, wrapping her arms around her waist like she used to do when she was little. I'm sorry, Mom, she sobbed. I'm so sorry, but he was going to take everything. He's done it before. He was going to leave tonight after the wedding. I found proof. Rachel's arms tightened around Amy as more police officers arrived. The guests were being asked to stay for statements. David, or Daniel, was led out in handcuffs, his perfectly tailored tuxedo wrinkled, his boutonniere crushed. The inheritance from Grandma and Grandpa, Emmy hiccuped against her mom's dress. The house, everything. He had it all planned. I couldn't let him hurt you like he hurt those other families. Aunt Linda appeared with a chair just as Rachel's legs gave out. They helped her sit, her white dress pooling around her like spilled milk. Katie's mom brought water. Someone turned off the wedding music that was still playing softly in the background. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and shocked conversations. Emmy showed the officers everything she'd gathered. The evidence, the fake IDs, the flight booking, the records of his previous crimes. The police were amazed at how thorough her investigation had been. You should be a detective, one officer told her with a smile. But Emmy was barely listening. She couldn't take her eyes off her mom, worried about how this would affect her. It wasn't until later that evening, after all the guests had gone home and the police had finished taking statements, that Amy and Rachel finally had a moment alone. They sat in their kitchen, still in their fancy dresses, picking at the wedding cake that someone had thoughtfully brought home. How did you know? Rachel asked softly. When did you first suspect something was wrong? Amy put down her fork. Little things at first. The way he changed around his phone. The weird conversations I overheard. But then I found evidence of his other marriages. She hesitated. Are you mad at me? Rachel set her plate aside and pulled Amy close. Mad at you? Honey, you saved me. You saved us. I'm so sorry I didn't see it myself. I'm supposed to be the grown-up, the one protecting you. You always protect me, Mom, Amy said. This time it was my turn to protect you. Over the next few weeks, more of Daniel's story came out. There were other victims who came forward, other families he had destroyed. The police found storage units full of stolen items from his previous marriages. His getaway driver was caught and turned out to be an accomplice who had helped him pull off similar schemes before. The story made the local news. Some people called Amy a hero, but she didn't feel like one. She just felt relieved that her mom was safe, that their home and savings were secure, that no other families would be hurt by David's lies. 1 month after the wedding that wasn't, Rachel and Amy sat in their backyard, drinking hot chocolate even though it was warm outside. It was their comfort ritual. The garden David had helped plant was blooming, but they decided to keep it. We can make new memories here, Rachel had said. Mom? Amy asked, watching a butterfly land on their rosebush. Are you okay? Really okay? Rachel was quiet for a moment. You know what I realized? The real love story wasn't about me and David. It was about us, you and me. A mother and daughter who would do anything to protect each other. Amy leaned against her mom's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with chocolate. The butterfly fluttered away, and she thought about how sometimes beautiful things don't last, but that's okay because other beautiful things, more real things, take their place. Rachel kissed the top of Amy's head. We're going to be fine, you know, more than fine. We're going to be amazing. And sitting there in their backyard, with the sun setting and their hot chocolate getting cold, Amy knew her mom was right. They had each other, and that was better than any fairy tale romance. That was real love, the kind that makes you brave, that makes you strong, that makes you fight for what's right. The wedding that never happened had taught them both something valuable. Sometimes the happiest endings aren't the ones you plan for, but the ones that come from being true to yourself and protecting the ones you love, no matter what.